Um, Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I am Danny Plugger. I'm the Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail. Thank you for joining us. We are hosting this event with the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. I get the pleasure of introducing somebody who has a lot of rail hats, Meredith Richards. She is co-chair of VHSR as well as one of our former presidents and longest serving president. And she's also president of VRPI among many other hats that she wears. And so I would like to welcome Meredith. I'm going to ask everybody to remember to keep your microphones muted. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and Michael Testament or myself will ask them at the end. And that this presentation will be put onto YouTube sometime at the beginning of next week. And so thank you everybody again for attending, and Meredith, over to you.
Hello, I should have put one of my rail hats on, I guess. Danny, thank you so much. And thanks to Virginians for High-Speed Rail for co-hosting with us today, and particularly for hosting us on your Zoom account and with your knowledge about how to set up a webinar. We really appreciate it. And Danny can tell you that the Virginia Rail Policy Institute and VHSR, Virginians for High-Speed Rail, coordinate and collaborate our activities all the time. So I want to tell you just a bit about the Virginia Rail Policy Institute, because I know most of you won't be familiar with it, and I know it sounds a little odd. While many of us on the board of directors and our fellows are in fact rail advocates, and some of us are very active in organizations like Virginians for High-Speed Rail and the Rail Passengers Association, which are passenger rail advocacy groups. In fact, Virginia Rail Policy is a little different from an advocacy group. Our mission is to advance both freight and passenger rail through better public rail policy. And to advance that mission, what we do is we examine rail policies. Now we focus on Virginia, but we also look at federal rail policies because Virginia has a good deal of Amtrak services that serve our stations with long distance trains. And we critique existing policies. We analyze alternative approaches to rail policy, and we create a public forum where we have reports and articles and presentations and programs like this one to educate about rail policy and sometimes to advance different ideas and approaches to rail policy. And our board of directors and our fellows are the core of the Rail Policy Institute. They do all the research work, they do the writing. And if you go to our website, varpi.org, you'll see some of our work. You'll see how we present rail policy. We often, however, bring in outside experts like today's speaker to also instruct us on rail policy. But we've been in existence since 2002, and during that time, we have often challenged the existing rail policies in Virginia and recommended new ways of doing things. And I'll tell you a little bit about how Virginia has been doing recently in a minute. I want to note that one of the most enduring and daunting rail policies that we deal with all the time and that we're always writing about and fretting over is the relationship between freight and passenger rail in America. And as anyone who's on this webinar probably knows, that happens because across the country, with the exception of the Northeast Corridor and some publicly owned corridors within individual states, most of the track, most of the infrastructure, the passenger trains run on is owned by the freight railroads, usually the large Class 1 railroads. And so these relationships get to be pretty important. And our goal, of course, as the passenger goal for the passenger operators is usually to run more trains to more places with a high level of on-time performance. There are a number of states now that are working, and many of you probably are from these states, that are partnering with Amtrak to run and fund state-supported regional trains. Virginia has 6 such trains that it's been partnering with starting in 2009. And so the state's goal typically is to expand the service to meet growing demand for the service with more trains, more frequencies, extensions to new routes, and to maintain a reliable level of on-time performance. But this often does not align very well with the business interest of the freight railroads who are hosting the passenger trains. Their interest typically is, because their businesses in making money and satisfying their shareholders while serving their customers. And very often these interests come into conflict. So we put in agreements, we make agreements with the passenger railroads, with the freight, pardon me, between the freight and the passenger railroads. Of course, there are always agreements involved as to before we launch the passenger trains on the railroad. But even when these agreements are pretty well composed, very often the day-to-day operating practices of the railroad itself, the dispatching practices, the maintenance practices, whatever, these very often will come into very real conflict on a day-to-day basis with the terms of the condition of the agreements and with the intention of the agreement. And so sometimes it's a question of the railroad delivering the service, even though the agreement may be fairly strong. And of course, what we do know about how the Class 1 railroads have resisted any regulation, particularly at the federal level, after PRIA, the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, was passed in 2008. The Association of American Railroads spent the next 8 years challenging the constitutionality and other aspects of the regulations that were put in place to set standards for on-time performance and sanctions when on-time performance was not maintained at a certain level. And that even went to the Supreme Court for 2 years, which gives you, two times. And it has now been resolved, but it does give you some idea of how important it is to the passenger railroads. I'm sorry, I'm getting passenger and freight mixed up today verbally, but with our freight host, it's very important for them not to be regulated and to stay pretty much in control of what they're doing. So one of the reasons Virginia Rail Policy Institute is hosting this webinar now is because in December, the governor and Secretary of Transportation in Virginia announced a series of very sweeping new rail initiatives in a 10-year revolutionary program. It is really a game changer for Virginia. A $3.7 billion, that is with a B, dollar program that will result actually in a doubling of our state-sponsored train services and a doubling of commuter services between Washington and the Virginia suburbs on the I-95 corridor. So we have a sweeping, transformative new rail program in Virginia that is going to require a lot of new agreements with the host railroad, CSX. In addition, Virginia has for a number of years had some issues for a number of years. Oh, goodness, I'm having some audio problems. For a number of years, Virginia has been pretty much at loggerheads with Norfolk Southern Railroad, and we can't seem to break through some of their resistance to adding new passenger service on their tracks. So we're here to listen to one of the experts who's internationally well known for his ability to collaborate in very productive and effective relationships with the host railroads, and to grow passenger service in a rather extraordinary way that he did in California. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Ken Byers, who's going to introduce our speaker today. Ken is a member of the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the Rail Policy Institute, and he has been serving for several weeks now as the interim chair of the Rail Passengers Association after the resignation of the former chair. So Ken, and Ken also, I should tell you, was an Amtrak locomotive engineer for a good part of his career. So Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Meredith. Can you hear me? I'm not sure what I'm doing here.
I can hear you.
Okay. I've known Gene Skoropowski for over 30 years, primarily through our involvement with the Rail Passengers Association, where we both served on the board. And I might add Meredith is one of our newest board members. He was a commuter rail rider in Boston in the 1967 to 77 and became involved in issues there while working as an architect. He was hired by MBTA commuter rail operation in 1977 and became the chief railroad services officer. He moved to SEPTA, where he was assistant general manager for planning, development, and real estate. And then he went to Fluor Corporation as director of rail projects. But the main thing that Gene brings to us is his experience with the Capitol Corridor in California. He was hired by BART to head the office, managing the state-supported service running between San Jose and Sacramento. His challenge was to grow it. This was his first direct dealing with a major freight railroad, Union Pacific, who had a reputation of hostility towards passenger rail service. But under his direction, more than 100 million in capital improvements were made by 2006, and service frequency was increased incrementally from 4 round trips to 16. The corridor became the third busiest and most on time in the Amtrak operated network. Gene retired from CCJPA in 2009 and joined HNTB working on the Orlando-Tampa high-speed rail project, from which he retired in 2012. And then he went to work for All Aboard Florida as Senior Vice President of Railroad Operations to develop the Bright Line private higher-speed intercity service between Miami and Orlando. Currently, he's retired from AAF and working for as an independent consultant associated with T.Y. Lin International, helping with rail programs and projects. Gene, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Meredith. I guess from the number of retirements that you have listed, I keep retiring, but keep working. My request on this was to outline the relationship that was established between the Capitol Corridor and the Union Pacific Railroad, and to focus on how that relationship developed. There were 4 primary partners in this Capitol Corridor service: the Union Pacific Railroad, which owned the railroad, maintained the railroad, and dispatched the railroad. Amtrak, who was our contract operator, brought to the table their operating staff expertise, the insurance and liability issue, which was no small issue in California, and the federally mandated right of access. Amtrak's shortcoming was, of course, it never had any capital program money, so it really brought nothing to the table, so it relies on the states to actually take that action. The California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans as it's known out there, managed 3 state-supported services: the newest of which was the Capital Corridor, started in 1993 with 4 round trips. But by 1996, the level of ridership and the growth on it was marginal and was actually considered, because of a state budgetary issue, for discontinuance. Well, the 8 counties that are served by that Capital Corridor said this is way too important to our economy to let this go. So we will create our own special purposes district known as the Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority, and we want to take over the management of that service. Oh, the gentleman who negotiated the transfer between Caltrans and the Capital Corridor, a guy named Bill Fleischer, was retiring, and I was contacted about taking over, and I started in August of 1999. At that point in time, the transfer from Caltrans to the CCJPA was acrimonious at best. The relationship with the railroad was one of a potential for a lawsuit regarding on-time performance. So I was stepping into a hornet's nest to try to get this service straightened out and get it to grow. The only 2 sources of revenue for the Capital Corridor were, number one, passenger fares, which were at 29% of the cost when I got there, and the state subsidy. So, and the capital money was all from the state capital program, and there were bond issues that provided the capital money for investment. There was no federal money in the Capital Corridor program, which, looking in retrospect, was a real blessing, because we'd probably still be doing the paperwork that would be required to get federal money. So we were able to work very quickly and very closely. The 8 counties gave me a charge: grow the ridership and build a better working relationship with Union Pacific. Growing the ridership was really contingent upon frequency, reliability, and competitive travel time. Those were the 3 major considerations for the riders. We knew we had the market. We paralleled 3 hopelessly congested interstate highways: Interstate I-80, Interstate I-680, and Interstate 580. So we really had a place where, if we had the attractive service, we could bring the riders in. Getting that service into place was more difficult. In the early 1990s, the state had invested $95 million into then Southern Pacific to upgrade the line between Oakland and Sacramento. And in exchange, they bought a perpetual right for the right to run up to 20 round-trip trains on that segment of the corridor. That was a steal. I can tell you from my later experience with Union Pacific and with today's arrangements with the railroads, you would never be able to buy that level of access for that amount of money. However, it set the stage for the growth. Caltrans owned all the equipment, leased it to the Capital Corridor for operation and maintenance. My first meetings with the railroad were, let's say, less than cordial. I was told that the increase in the passenger services did nothing but disrupt the freight railroad. There was nothing in it for them. It gave them more aggravation, and they really didn't want to deal with it. I proposed a different operating agreement with the railroad. To date, the Caltrans agreements with the railroad relied solely on Amtrak's relationship with the railroad, and that means minimal payments for train mile access to the railroad and a very complicated incentive program for on-time performance. So we proposed, first of all, let's take a look at what would be required to operate more service and do it reliably. And this was a joint effort with the freight railroad. Union Pacific brought in a new manager named Tom Jacoby to the Western region, and his team really was the team that understood where we were coming from, and saw the benefits that could accrue to Union Pacific from a constructive financial relationship with the Capital Corridor. Amtrak's approach traditionally has been, we have a right of access so we can be squatters on your property. We took a very different approach. We don't want to be squatters on your property. We want to be a business partner. In fact, we want to be a customer that you value having on your property. So we negotiated with the railroad first a master design and engineering agreement, which would identify projects, and then the Capital Corridor would fund the engineering work to get the projects to the point where they could be priced, and we could go to the state to get the capital resources needed for it. We did a second operating master agreement for construction and maintenance. And these two agreements took about 18 months to negotiate, but once we had them in place, if we had a project that we wanted to build, I didn't have to negotiate an agreement. All we did was an amendment to that master agreement, which identified the scope of the project, the budget, the schedule, the benefits that would accrue to the Capital Corridor in terms of either increased frequency, reduced travel time, sometimes both, and level of reliability. The other component of it was how to get additional money into the railroad for good performance, sweeten the deal. Well, the Amtrak agreement for incentives was on the Union Pacific. In order to earn any incentive money, the Union Pacific had to run all the Amtrak trains on its system at least 85% on time in order to get a payment. So even if the Capital Corridor ran at 100% on time, the Union Pacific still wouldn't get any money if all of the long distance trains were running at an average that took it below the 85%. So since Amtrak was our contractor and the Union Pacific was our railroad, we indicated, and I insisted on, a separate standalone tripartite agreement with Union Pacific, Amtrak, and the Capital Corridor. Amtrak continued to calculate the on-time performance the same way it always had, but the Capital Corridor would pay the railroad for increased on-time performance. And that agreement basically was, if they had 100% of their earned incentive, it would be about $3 million a year, which was significantly more than what Amtrak would pay just for the right of access to run the trains. The first year, we set the minimum bar, by the way, instead of 85% at 92%. That was the minimum in order to earn an incentive. The way it worked was very simple. The first month they hit 92%, they got 50% of that $3 million annual appropriation for on-time performance incentive. When they had consecutive months above 92%, it went to 75% of that. When they got to 96% on time, they got 75% for the first month, and every consecutive month after that they were above 96%, they got 100%. Well, it would be amazing to see the change in the on-time performance of the Capital Corridor. And if you go back and take a look at the history since about 2007, you will see that the Capital Corridor was the most on-time performance railroad in the entire Amtrak network, and still is. The other component of reliability was slow orders. And that primarily had to do with line and surfacing issues and worn frogs. It was a heavy freight corridor. The Port of Oakland is the big export port for California. So we were having a lot of delays on worn frogs, which then the welders had to come out, 10-mile-an-hour speed limit, etc. So I sat down with a guy named Dave Wickersham, who was the chief engineer for the railroad, and I said, what can we do to fix this? He said, well, look, I don't have enough in my budget for a maintenance away crew to get out and do the kind of line and surfacing that's needed. So I said, well, what would you need to do that? He said, well, I need a dedicated crew for it. How much would that dedicated crew cost? Oh, it's about $600,000 a year or $50,000 a month. I said, that's a no-brainer. Put the damn crew on and get out there and do all that line and surfacing. And that still is the arrangement today, where the crew works from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. each day. And that's when the least amount of traffic is on the railroad, so they have the maximum amount of productive time. We actually started it during the day, and we're getting about 2 hours of productive time, so that wasn't working. Wickersham said, well, our guys don't like to work at night. I said, well, what would it take? So we went back and talked to the union guys. They said, we want $1 more an hour. I said, deal, done. And that's the way the arrangement works today. For the frogs, it was a more complex issue. There is a development that's out on the railroad today where they have what they call spring frogs. And this basically doesn't allow the kind of wear and tear where there's a crossing point. So the deal here was Capital Corridor bought the spring frogs. I think it was about $1 million a year for about a 3-year period to buy the frogs, and Union Pacific paid to install them. So the entire Capital Corridor has eliminated the standard frogs and put in the spring frogs, and as a result, no delays for worn frogs. And with the maintenance away gang, that's how you got your reliability up. In addition to that, the side benefit was we were able to take our travel time because we didn't have to build into the schedule potential for delay. The biggest issues that I guess that we have here are being certain that if you are the state, that you know that this is your service. This is not Amtrak's service, even though they may run it. They work for you. We had an analysis done when we were making the capital improvements, because we had some places where we were going from single track to double track. We were going track from putting in crossovers. We brought in the dispatchers themselves. Union Pacific paid to bring them in for meetings in California from their Omaha segment. And there were proposals to separate the railroad into 2 railroads. You have a passenger railroad and a freight railroad. When the RTC modeling was done, and when you talk to the dispatchers, they really discouraged that, because they said, well, look, if you get 2 railroads parallel, if you want to do maintenance on one, you're kind of taking it out of business. And if you have an incident anywhere on a passenger or freight railroad, you don't have the flexibility to have an integrated system. You can run it under normal conditions as a separate railroad, but you want to be certain that you have that interconnectivity to be able to run a train around an incident or to take care of maintenance away. There was a place where we would have required a 4-track segment, and it found that by combining the operation into a unified plant, we were able to reduce the capital cost by providing a 3-track segment, and it provided enough flexibility for the freight and the passenger services to operate together. Now, whenever we did a capital program with the railroad, we built into that program a 7% growth in the freight business to be accommodated by the fixed plant. The lesson learned in dealing with the railroad on capacity is that you need to give them the fixed facilities that they need to be able to run the service on time. If you're just trying to squeeze your train onto an existing congested railroad, neither of the services are going to run well, the freight service nor the passenger service. So between the operating agreement that we had, the capital agreements that we had, the maintenance away crew that we put on, the increased incentives that we provided to the railroad, all of a sudden the railroad began to realize this is a good business partner for us. And that was the objective that I wanted from the beginning, is to be a valued business partner. Dennis Duffy, who was the former executive VP of Union Pacific's operation, retired. But when he did his last presentation at the ARIMA conference here in Orlando, he said publicly out that the best operating agreement that they have with any passenger service is on the Capital Corridor. And when I transitioned over my many retirements to the Brightline service, many of the components of what we developed with Union Pacific were integrated into that relationship that exists between the All Aboard Florida Brightline service and the Florida East Coast Railway. So we tried to take the components that seemed to work. This seemed to be a good business deal. The Capital Corridor continues to provide capital funding for expansion of the Union Pacific service. As a major study and a segment going on to increase the frequency between Sacramento and Roseville, north of Sacramento, from the current 1 round trip to 10 round trips. And it's all funded through the state and the Capital Corridor. I think maybe at that point, that's kind of an overall snapshot. Maybe I'll just stop and let folks ask any questions that they have out there.
Thank you, Gene. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
You can. All right. Thank you very much, Gene. We did ask for questions to be submitted in advance. That was a fascinating story, incidentally. I wish we all had those kinds of relationships and agreements in place. And so Michael Testerman, I'm going to introduce Michael. Michael Testerman is also, he's our executive director, and he is on the Council of State Representatives for the Rail Passenger Association and has been for many years. Michael has been the collector of the questions, and he is going to read the questions to you, Gene. So Michael?
Okay. Hi, Gene.
Hello, Michael.
I have 2 lead questions that sort of pick up where you left off about on-time performance. RPA Council member Steve Strauss from New York City says, would you talk some about to what degree Amtrak should or should not pursue the same path to improve on-time performance on their state-supported trains and on the long-distance trains?
Well, it's complex with Amtrak because, as I said at the beginning, Amtrak has a lot of things that they do well. The train operations staff, the issue of access is very important, but what they don't have is the critical component in dealing with any freight railroad, and that is a source of capital funding where they bring something to the table in negotiations. And this is why the state-supported services, if you look around the country, represent virtually all of the growth from 20 million annual riders to 32 million annual riders. They're virtually all in the state-supported services. So the states are really in control on this, and there is an advantage to it in the sense that there's a local, it's mine, okay? This is our service. It may be run by Amtrak, it may have an Amtrak name on it, but it is our service. In the case of California, California actually owns all of the rolling stock, and the rolling stock says on the outside of it, Amtrak California. It's painted in a California color. It's unique. It only operates within California, but it to me demonstrates the level of partnership that has to exist. And right now, Amtrak has never in its history been provided with a source of capital funds. So it's going to be very difficult in Amtrak's case to be able to mimic this. It's really up to the individual states.
Ken Briers has a similar question. The host railroads don't want Amtrak because of the statutory rates of compensation are too low. Do you have a suggestion of how we might actually fix this?
Well, I mean, as I told you, what the Capital Corridor did was figure out what the railroad needed. When I talked to the maintenance away guy, and he says, I don't have the money to put on the kind of line and surface gang that'll keep your slow orders down. Because I said, how much money will that cost? And We did a dedicated, these guys only work 5 days a week. They only work on this stretch of the railroad. And I got to tell you, they're probably one of the happiest campers in Union Pacific, because the railroad has a habit of shifting people depending upon the season where the work is all around their network. So, you know, the states you're in the driver's seat as long as you've got the money. I mean, the railroad's first question to anybody that comes with passenger service is, you got the money to do this? And the answer is no. I said, well, call us when you do. And if you have the money, then they'll sit down, and I will say most railroads will sit down and at least talk to you. And if you can structure a business deal that works for them and works for you, that's how this Capital Corridor deal came about.
We got a question from Steve Roberts, whom I'm sure you know. He also wants to know, what are your thoughts about capital access payments in addition to avoidable costs for intercity passenger trains usage on freight railroads?
Well, it's the same story. You know, Amtrak has this statutory right, and at a minimum, what do they call it, the incremental access fee, which really doesn't give the railroad adequate compensation, not even enough money to do the kind of maintenance that's required for reliable passenger service. This is the big problem that Amtrak as a national entity has. If Amtrak had a source of capital money, I don't know, I'll guess $100 million a year, that they could go out to a freight railroad and say, hey, look, we know you got a congestion point here. We know we have problems with delays. What investments would we need to make to fix this problem? In the case of Union Pacific, we did it twofold. We did it, number one, by doing a RTC model analysis, which wasn't always right. And the second one was actually bringing in the dispatchers who actually dispatched the trains. And I can recall one incident where we had the RTC model said you needed to put in a third track in a certain segment. And the dispatcher says, no, don't waste your money there. Put in a crossover, universal crossover at this location. And that will alleviate the problems that we're having. And that's what we ended up doing. And it did exactly what the dispatchers said it would do.
Our vice president of the RPI, Mark Perot, has two questions. A, what has been the trend of freight traffic on the Capital Corridor over the years that it was improved with the public and private cooperation? Does the Union Pacific have alternative routes that make putting more passenger service on the Capital Corridor easier?
Well, the freight level fluctuated anywhere from 18 freight trains a day up to as many as 30. It depends upon what the business is on the railroad. I suspect it's down right now. In the case of the Capital Corridor, there was an alternate route over the Altamont Pass, but that was intermixed with the Altamont Corridor Express service, and that was all single track. So there was limited alternate routing available, but the primary access, because with the investments that the Capital Corridor made, it's an all minimum two-track railroad between Sacramento and Oakland, which was able to facilitate the movement of these long freight trains going into Port of Oakland.
Mark comes from a legal counsel perspective. That's what he did at Norfolk Southern before his retirement. And his next question, while it may seem to some to get into the weeds, it's actually a very big part of public policy considerations. What did the authority in California indemnify the freight carrier from all liability for passenger incidents, even when caused in part or totally by the freight carrier or its employees? This comes up often in other contract discussions.
Right. This is one of the major reasons why all of the intercity services in California are contracted with Amtrak, because Amtrak is the only entity, I won't say the only entity, because Florida does accept its own liability, but the state was prohibited from indemnifying any entity for liability. So Amtrak, because they are the contract operator, Amtrak accepts that liability for its operation. So that is what satisfies the freight railroad. There's no exposure by the state or by the independent agency.
I'm looking to see if there's some other questions germane to what we've already gone over. There are a few others that are more general. Let me go to one that our Secretary John Bell has raised, and I think you have some experience outside of California that might inform the answer. Is there anybody in Europe that faces the interplay of intercity passenger, commuter, and freight rail the way we do in this country? It may be that all the rail in Europe, or a lot of it, is the actual rail infrastructure is government owned and not privately owned as in the US, but I'm wondering how freight and passenger rail coexist in Europe.
Yeah, that's, I worked, as you probably know, for a number of years in France, working on the HighSpeed projects. It's very different because, as you point out, the infrastructure is publicly owned. That's number one. They treat the services, passenger services and freight services, much like they treat highways, airports, or other infrastructure, is that the infrastructure is publicly owned, but the operation, in many cases, more cases now, are private companies operating on those public access infrastructure. And like on a highway, if you got 10 cars sitting for more than 2 seconds, it's a traffic jam, so you widen the highway. In Europe, if you have congestion on the freight, they increase the physical facilities to be able to accommodate the demand. There are issues that arise between some of the local commuter carriers, which have been spun off from the national intercity services, but again, they're all still operating on publicly owned and publicly funded, publicly maintained right-of-way, and they have a user fee for the entities, whether they are the state-owned intercity services or the regional private entities. They pay a certain access fee to use those public facilities.
Would you say that all of the users of that shared infrastructure mutually benefit, or are some disadvantaged over others?
My understanding is that the intercity services get priority, intercity passenger services. And on the high-speed lines, there is no freight, and it's only dedicated to the high-speed trains. But on lines that are not, that are multiple use lines, they are able to make it work because of common dispatching for all of the services.
On the Capitol Corridor, what was the top authorized operating speed?
Good question. Maximum speed, we agreed with Union Pacific, would be 79 miles an hour. However, we agreed that the track maintenance standard would be to FRA Class 5, which would allow you to go to 90 if you had the signal system in place. We did that more for insurance of ride quality. It took about 3 years for the UP maintenance forces to get the Capitol Corridor segment of that railroad from Class 4 to Class 5. But once it got into Class 5, all the slow orders disappeared, because if there was a slow order, it basically impacted the freight operation, which by going to Class 5, allowed the freights to operate at 70 miles an hour as well. It was a very beneficial relationship between the two.
That sort of segues to a situation that we're facing in Virginia, and we're looking for best practices. Now, Virginia and North Carolina are both developing their respective segments of the Southeast high-speed rail corridor, and it won't really be high-speed rail, it'll be higher speed rail. But as is precedent in other parts of the country, like in Illinois, down to St. Louis, you're seeing a corridor, and across Michigan, developed for about 110 mile an hour top operating or authorized speed. Neither of the freight railroads that Virginia is working with want to go much over 79 miles an hour, if that, and over a longer multi-state corridor. When you're thinking about endpoints that might be Washington and Charlotte, rather than the intermediate points, going a lot slower between those intermediate points sort of lowers your competitiveness with travel by automobile or by regional air. So we were wondering, hold on while I grab my thoughts. Do you have a best practices idea for how a longer corridor, not just one that's more or less regional or commuter rail, could be developed so that you have a uniform speed from one end to the other, rather than jurisdictional slope traps?
Yeah, what we found on the Capitol Corridor, which stretches over it's a 170-mile corridor, is that even staying with 79 miles an hour, once you reduced the slow ones, you were able to get the dispatching. We were able to take significant amount, 20 minutes of travel time out of that service, staying with the same speed on the same distance of the railroad. Reliability on the railroad is really all about maintenance. And, if there's anything that was a very common ground with the Union Pacific and the Capitol Corridor, it was if there was a need to do maintenance and even to take tracks out of service or reduce service during a maintenance window, we would do it because we knew that when the work was done, you have a much more reliable railroad. Union Pacific usually took about 2 or 3 weeks to do a major track blitz on the railroad. Their idea was you do a renewal on a segment basis and you do it consistently, and you do it concurrent each year, so that you do the first 10 miles this year, the next 10 miles the next year. So by the time it's time for the first one to get renewed again, you've actually renewed the railroad. So it's a cyclical renewal program. And we would tell the riders for the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever the take was for that maintenance work to be done, we're going to do a modified schedule. And we never had any problems with complaints with people because we let them know up front. We protected the most heavily traveled parts of the day, and Union Pacific forces had enough track time to be able to do the kind of maintenance that's needed to keep the railroad in that Class 5 condition.
Michael?
Yes.
And Gene, this is Meredith. Are we finished with the questions that were submitted beforehand?
I've got about 3 more.
Oh, okay.
Can I say one thing quick about Gene's last comment? That is, you gain more by raising the low speeds than you do by raising the highest speed. And
Correct.
It's not just maintenance. There are many locations on a freight railroad where you've got something with a hand thrown switch. You got to stop, throw the switch, put the switch back. And if you put a 30-mile-an-hour crossover through there that was signaled, you'd probably save 15, 20 minutes. And you can pick up a lot of spots like that along an existing railroad and then improve it that way. And the other side of it is the leap to cab signals or some kind of train control that lets you exceed 79 miles an hour is another order of magnitude in expense that you can avoid if you make those slow speed improvements.
Ken, as a follow-up to that, what we found on the Union Pacific, when there was no real significant level of passenger service on the line, many of their freight customers, they did switching on the main line, which of course plugs the main line while they're doing that work. So one of the programs that the Capital Corridor jointly defined with the Union Pacific was to build sidings to get this stuff off the main line, so it was available to both the freight and the passenger services. And that again is another issue that was able to reduce travel time.
Right. And to bring it back to the local situation, think of the line between Main Street Station and AY, where you reach the, Acton Yard. Imagine if you could do that at 79 miles an hour instead of 30, what you'd gain on a trip between Main Street and Washington, D.C.
Yeah, the more you can sustain a 79-mile-an-hour operation, the better off you're going to be. You don't need to go to super high speed, although my own gut is once you are able to demonstrate that you can generate the market at that moderate level of speed, you then will have justification for going to a higher standard, 110, 125, 150. This is very much in parallel to what the Europeans had done in terms of their building up of the high-speed line. China's an exception because they just decided we're going to build high speed with their environmental process. They just went and did it. So,
or lack of it.
Yeah.
Well, may I ask us now to, we have about 5 minutes, and I want to make one announcement. This webinar has been recorded. We will create a video. We will have a video available. It will be posted on the Virginia Rail Policy Institute website. You will also be getting, if you were part of the webinar and signed up for it, you'll be getting notice with a link to the video. So we will have that available. And finally, I'd like to ask Gene Skoropowski, who's given us quite an eye-opening talk today. If you would please, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, okay. If you would please give us your final thoughts, your summary of your talk today. Just a few final thoughts.
Well, I go back to when you are working on any particular project, when you have multiple parties and some of the parties are not as enthusiastic, you have to find what's important to those parties and see if you can find common ground to build a relationship and a program that satisfies their concerns as well as gets you what your objectives are. This is how I approach the Union Pacific, and my belief is that even today, the Union Pacific, after 20 years, really considers the Capital Corridor a good business partner. And that's the relationship you want.
Thank you very much. We're still getting questions. People I see are posting questions now online. I wish we had more time for them. This has been really instructive, and we're all so appreciative of your sharing your knowledge and your experience and your wisdom with us, Gene. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome. That's the only thing I have to offer at my stage of life. It's my experience.
Well, I know you work as a consultant. Is that correct? So you're still offering your services.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to help people who have projects that they want to implement or improvements that they want to make. And if they're at points of loggerheads or decision making, and I can help them as they go through it, that's what I have to offer.
Hopefully people will call on you for that, because I think we could all use those kinds of insights and that kind of assistance. So not that I'm involved in making agreements, but many people are who are on this webinar today. Thank you very much, Gene. And with that, we'll call an end to the webinar.
Thanks, Gene.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
And Michael and Ken.
Thank you. Thank you very much.